Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History Podcast, and much more. You can learn more about the Parthenon Podcast Network, how to support the History of the Papacy podcast, the History of the Papacy on YouTube, Beyond the Big Screen, and much, much more. Even links to leaving iTunes review by just going to the website a2zhistorypage.com. A great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going to patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your becoming a patron on Patreon really helps go a long way to keeping this project sustainable for a long time in the future. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Jorn, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. In today's episode, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow takes us through the setup of the Easter controversy as it played out in the early church in Britain. She walks us through who the big players were and the multiple parties that formed. She will also explain that this controversy was much, much, much more than just the old Roman versus Celt story we hear so often. There were many issues, groups, and opinions that were all at play in this really pivotal time in church history. Let's find out more. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. I'd like to welcome back Dr. Carolyn McNamara to to continue discussing our trip through the history of Christianity in Ireland and the British Isles. I would definitely highly suggest you go back and listen to the previous episodes, especially the one on archaeology. I think people will really enjoy that. Today, we're diving into a really interesting topic that I think is incredibly important and probably not as well known, especially when you really dig into the nitty-gritty of the topic. And it's the Easter controversy between the churches in Ireland and in England and the British Isles in general. Maybe lay out, Dr. McNamara, some of the issues that are involved with this Easter controversy.
Yeah, so the main issue, of course, is the calculation of when Easter is meant to fall. And so this is done through a process called Computus, which is just the name for the maths involved. And it's generally a fairly complicated process because it deals with both lunar and solar calendars. And in addition to that, it's got to be after the date of Passover. So it has to occur after the equinox and the full moon after Passover, but also on a Sunday. And that just almost feels like a mental game of Twister. So it gets into some fairly complex maths that I try to avoid myself as a historian. But yeah, that's the main thing. And then other things that we see discussed in Ireland and Britain specifically is kind of the tonsure that is used by monks in orders. There's some other really brief mentions of other possible things, but they're never really identified clearly. And it may just kind of be people trying to make digs at each other in small ways.
It's the whole idea of the dating of Easter. It's so complicated. I got into this in some of my earlier episodes on the Council of Nicaea, where they really hammered that out. And there was a big controversy whether it should always be on the certain date, the 15th of Nisan, or should it be on the Sunday? And so they come up with this really complicated equation of, like you said, all these different dates that are swirling around each other. Was it pretty much that by the point that the Irish and the Easter controversy in Britain, I guess you might say that the broad strokes of it were figured out, the Easter controversy, but now they're digging into sort of controversy 2.0 of these whole ideas of lunar cycles and yearly cycles. And it's even more complicated than what they were arguing about a few hundred years earlier at the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this really is kind of Easter controversy 2.0, if you like. And for people who have heard of the Easter controversy, it's really usually fashioned in this, quote unquote, Irish church versus the Roman church. But really, there's three different methods of calculation that are all kind of floating around near the same time here. So we've got what's called the 84-year cycle, or the Celtic cycle that it's frequently called, which is what was in use in Britain and Ireland. And that includes, the British church, or what we might think of as the Welsh. It would include the Irish and the Picts. So you've got them using this 84-year cycle. You've got this Victorian calculation that was created by Victorius of Aquitaine in 457 that was in use in Gaul and Spain. And then you've got this 19-year cycle that was created by Dionysius Exiguus that didn't get adopted in Rome until the 630s, which we might think of as fairly late in the game as far as this is concerned, and the fact that we'll kind of talk about the Synod of Whitby only happened in 664.
It's interesting too, because the Easter controversy and the controversy over the dating of Ireland in the course of church history, it comes up again with the Gregorian calendar reforms in the Middle Ages, and then even today if you look at the Eastern Orthodox, they've had a controversy over it. And that's why if you look at your calendar, they'll have the Orthodox Easter and the Catholic Easter, because it's another controversy with the dating of Easter. So we're talking about a controversy that's been brewing for 1700 years or so.
Yeah, that's quite a while to still be working on the same issue.
That's one of the big issues with this whole controversy is the Roman church is starting to get some influence in the churches in Britain. What could we say about that?
So I think that we want to be careful about how much power we consider Rome to have in this period. I mean, they are recognized as the seat of Peter and Paul, so they do have this kind of, I don't know, we could call it first among equals kind of situation. So they are recognized as having a position of significance, but they're not the kind of powerful central, seat of Catholicism like we see today. So today the Pope says X, Y, and Z, and everybody goes, right, that's what it is. But back in this time period, there was a lot of disagreement that was happening and that was allowed to happen. And so if different bishops in Gaul or in Britain or in Ireland were having a disagreement, they might send people to Rome to get Rome to act as a kind of appellate court for decision making. So if they say, we can't get together and agree on this, so we'll go to Rome, which has authority that we respect, but not necessarily that we always obey, to get some assistance in trying to make some decisions when they're having trouble.
I'll use this as a time to do a little foreshadowing of my next series. I think you're absolutely correct in that what we view as papal power and pope power today really is a fairly modern innovation. And it's something that they would not have recognized at all back then, that a pope could just say, well, just do it this way, and that's how it is. And that there would be a universal idea coming from Rome was very much something that was going to happen in the long distant future from this point in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, one of the other issues, and it was a pretty major issue, was the issue of tonsure, monastic tonsure. Can you tell us a little bit about what monastic tonsure is and what was their problem with each other's tonsure?
Sure. And I think this issue of tonsure kind of breaks down into an overarching, desire to prove more orthodox than thou art that was kind of wrapped up in this whole controversy. So the tonsure itself is a method of cutting of the hair of, clerics in monastic orders. And so we've got this Roman tonsure, which is what everybody's going to think of when you think of, the old Robin Hood cartoons that have the monks with the hair not on the crown of his head, or in most movies, that's the kind of tonsure you're going to see, where you've got kind of the top of the head is bare, leaving this ring of hair kind of around the edge. And then the Irish tonsure, we've got a bit less specific information on that, although I think there might be some depictions of it in art, but I'm not personally very familiar with them. But it was kind of a shaving of the head forward of a line that's kind of drawn from one ear up over the top of the head down towards the other. And I don't have much that's more specific than that, but there's some idea that this tonsure may have come out of previous Druidic practices. But again, we don't have lots of firm evidence on that front. But we do know that there were some differences in them, and that this had become another point of contention, especially here we're seeing contention between Northumbrian kind of clerical and religious ideas versus this kind of Gaelic or Irish and also British religious ideas and behaviors.
Do you think that was a real bone of contention theologically, or was it more of an othering type situation at that point?
I'm sure they could come up with some theological reasons for it, but the sense that I get is that it's kind of this othering that's going on. We have other pieces of information coming out of, say, Whithorn at this time, which had previously been founded, as we understand it, by a Celtic, founder, but it had become part of Northumbria. And so when Northumbria started to have control over Whithorn, they liked to emphasize their orthodoxy and kind of make these insinuations that previously hadn't been as orthodox. So I really get the feeling that this is just another thing they were trying to heap on the pile of, pointing out this, as you said, otherness of this other, kind of behavior.
Was there any canons on how tonsure should be done, or was this really at this point something that it had evolved at that point to become the norm?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm not familiar with there being any canons on it by this point. That doesn't necessarily mean there weren't any, but I've not run into them yet.
Oh, and I was just going to add, I started doing a deep dive on these tonsures because I was familiar as much as the next person about the Robin Hood and the Friar Tuck one. The Irish one was kind of interesting because, like you said, they don't know 100% exactly how it was. And the ear to ear and shaving it forward, that looked kind of cool. But they had other ones where they would shave it and then leave a portion of the front unshaven as well, and that looked kind of odd. But it's really interesting that you would think such a mundane thing, especially, and I started to dive even deeper, that in the East, the monks didn't really have a hairstyle as such. They did a tonsure when they were made a monk, but it was just a symbolic cutting of their hair. And after that, they didn't have to have a certain hairstyle. So it's really interesting that a hairstyle would become so central of an issue.
Yeah, and that makes me think of the fact that we see written in some sources reference to the material that churches were made out of. So a lot of buildings and structures in early medieval Ireland were made out of wood, because they had it in plenty, and so a lot of things were made out of wood. And so you see these references in places like the life of Saint Malachy, where they say he came and he renovated the buildings and he built in stone according to the Roman manner. But that might just be a subtle dig at this orthodoxy question that started so long ago. So when we read these kinds of things, we have to go, okay, are they talking about actually physically rebuilding these buildings? Or is this just part of that othering language that we see as far back as, this Easter controversy.
Yeah, it's really interesting how all that starts to accumulate, and something that's over a religious issue can turn into cultural and turn into a whole other set of issues that all just get piled on top of each other. What are some of our sources for this whole issue at hand that we're talking about today with the Easter controversy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a few, impressive sources, I think. So we've got Bede, our kind of classical source to go to for this time period. Most people will know him as the Venerable Bede. So he discussed the Easter controversy quite a bit. He knew Saint Wilfrid personally, who was involved in the Council of the Synod of Whitby, which we'll talk about today. There were letters, lots of letters. People are sending plenty of letters. So there's between Columbanus, who was a saint who had studied in Bangor in the north of Ireland and then gone to the continent. He founded monasteries in modern day France and Italy. So he had some letters between himself and Pope Gregory the Great. There were letters from Pope-elect John IV to various different Irish clergymen, all named together. A letter from Lawrence, Bishop of Canterbury, Mellitus, Bishop of London, and Justus, Bishop of Rochester, to the bishops and abbots in Ireland. There was a letter from Pope Honorius to the Irish Church that was possibly sent around 628 after interacting with Columbanus's monastery at Bobbio. That's the final one that he established there in Italy. And then there's also a letter from Cumian, an abbot or maybe a bishop, to Segina, abbot of Iona, and the hermit Becan, possibly of Rum, which is an island in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland, that also discussed this issue of the Easter controversy. And then in addition, we've got the life of St. Wilfrid itself that's talking very specifically about the Synod of Whitby. So we've got some good sources to, approach this question of the Easter controversy and its associated Synod of Whitby.
And now a word from our sponsors. It's to me, going through this studying of this and some of the notes that you provided, it amazes me how much communication there was between Ireland and England and Rome, and the fact that some of those bishops you mentioned, like MacLeod of London, I believe he was from Syria originally. And there was other bishops there that had Greek origins or Italian origins. And it just amazes me at that point how much communication and travel there was in what we might consider the Dark Ages.
Oh, for sure. And even, when Rome is still active in Britain, there were forces from across the Roman Empire that were stationed in what we call England today, as far east as from Palmyra. So we know that there was a lot of movement going on, and that it was possible to be in touch and to be connected to places surprisingly far away at such an early time. But it really was something that was possible and that they did engage in.
These sources, how many actual letters, would you say there's a decent amount? I mean, to put it in the perspective of a person, are there a dozen letters that you work with, or 20, a score of them? How many letters do you really have, and letters and that sort of sources do you have to work with?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So from my perspective, and I work in the field of early medieval history, so it's an area that is kind of at a dearth or a lack of sources. So when I get more than like 4 or 5 of something, I'm thrilled about it. If we think of it in terms of just the sheer mass of communication we engage in on a daily basis today, it seems like nothing even worth mentioning. But if we're thinking in a historic context, especially in a time period where we don't have a lot of sources, what we have is fantastic. And we've got 4 letters from Columbanus alone, which I think is really wonderful. And we don't always have both sides of the conversation. They didn't necessarily have all the foresight that the president's office is going to have today, saving all of his correspondence so that way future historians will know everything. But even when we just have one side of that correspondence, we can still get an idea of what the other side was concerned about in seeing what the responses are to questions that must have been posed.
And so you have to figure if there's 4 letters, there's presumably 7 or 8 because they would have corresponded with someone. Is there much, do you know about letters and things like that there's record of, but you don't actually have that letter?
It does happen sometimes that things are mentioned that haven't survived in the historic record. And so those could be letters. I know that there's mention of a rule of St. Covgall that existed but doesn't survive, and so that would have been a rule for the behavior of monks in a monastery that we just don't have anymore, but we know it existed. So that does happen a fair bit.
And then one more question on this tack, you might say, or this track. How does the amount of sources you have compare to, say, your colleague across the hallway who was working in your time period in the Mediterranean world or in the Eastern Mediterranean world? How many sources would they have to work with?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I could answer with too much confidence, but I do know that, especially for my area, there is this understood lack of sources. And especially looking at Northern Britain, we have very, very few. Like the Life of St. Columba is one of the major sources that we have, versus an area in the Mediterranean that may have a much deeper time period of written sources and collecting written sources. So they're likely to have much more surviving documentation than we do. But we still have to think about kind of the vagaries and the possibilities of what is lucky enough to survive, because a lot of that survival really does come down to luck.
I guess one more question about that. How these sources that you have, has there been any newer discoveries, or are these mostly things that have been around since time immemorial, since this time period?
So there are new discoveries that happen kind of all the time, and there are things that are, reviewed in maybe new light. So there's discussions of things that have been written and who is the accepted author of them. So someone might have a new idea of, hey, let's think of it this way, and it might actually be something that this other person wrote. So we are kind of coming to new understandings, even sometimes of documents that we've known about for a while. But then there's also stuff that's still in archives that we may know that there's a letter on this topic, or we may know that it's a letter written by such and such person, but hasn't actually had a lot of research done to it. So my hope is that there's more out there that we'll find in the future that are, safely stored in archives, or who knows, found in the hall closet of someone's great aunt's house.
Well, thank you for indulging me. I could ask questions on that. That's sort of my side hustle, you might say, of reading interest, is reading about letters and writing technology. It's endlessly fascinating. Maybe in another life I could go go study that more officially, but I just love that topic.
Yeah, it's really interesting to dig into, whether it's the paraphernalia involved in this letter writing process, down to the conventions of, how do you start a letter? How do you close a letter? How do you address the letter? Just all of these things, and the materiality, like what you can learn about a writer just from the physical remains of this letter. What's the quality of that paper? Is it paper? Is it vellum? Has it been folded in this locking format in order to help keep it private? What does that tell us about that time period? So yeah, I definitely can see the interest in getting into all of that.
And another one that I've tried to do research in, and I've never found a great answer for it, is what was the the writing and editing process, sort of the whole writing process between making notes to having a published piece. Like you think of the Gospel of John, that, well, they say, or any writing where they say, oh, well, we think it was written in the 80s. But clearly that would have been where he had a final, any writer, you might say, had a final product then, but that could have been 20 years of research and writing and editing and revising. And how laborious would it be revising a document that you have to hand write something that today is maybe 60, 70, 80, 100 pages to then, okay, I made all my revisions. Now I have to rewrite that whole thing again.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think something that we can consider is first the existence of wax tablets. And so you had this kind of ephemeral writing capability through the use of wax tablets. So you can write on and then you can remelt the wax and kind of erase everything. So you have that as a means of kind of short-term writing and editing. Because if we think about, especially in this time period, the expense that goes along with acquiring the vellum, acquiring the things you need to make the paints, preparing the vellum, preparing all of the inks and everything. So it's unlikely that you're going to put much pen to paper, if you like, until you're really ready to do it for real. And that doesn't mean that people can't revise or can't redo. We do sometimes have surviving manuscripts that show a little bit of development in the same story or the same manuscript. But yeah, I think by the time they get to the point of writing this down in such a permanent fashion, they've probably done a lot of thinking or using more ephemeral, recording processes to do it. Mostly, I think, all in their head, which I think, the ability to retain information and recall and quality memory, it was probably a lot better for people who lived according to, what was a mostly oral society.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Even with the wax issue, wax is cheaper than vellum or papyrus or any of the other methods. But even I'm kind of a mini beekeeper. You don't get a ton of wax. Like, that's not a democratic way. You're still going to be a fairly high status person to even have enough wax to write, especially you're competing with candles and all the other things that people use for wax as well. That was a finite resource, that it's another technology that it kept it to a limited source of people who could really tap into that. Probably monastics more so than anybody, because they did so much beekeeping. They might have had more access to that than other people would have. But that's kind of maybe a little bit of guesswork on my part, but it kind of makes sense that even with wax, you're not going to have everybody having a chance to write on these wax tablets. It's fascinating to think about, because it's sort of the not so exciting part of it, but it's really interesting. Now, getting into our next, we're diving even more into Computus. What did Bangor have to say about Computus?
Yeah, so Bangor is kind of like one of the places that's close to my heart. So I try to bring it up, all the time when I'm talking about stuff. And Bangor as a monastery today really isn't as well known as I think it ought to be. So it was very well known in its own time as a center of learning. It was associated with a number of different literary styles and capabilities. And they had a person, his name was Silan Macumind, who was probably the first teacher of Columbanus, but who became abbot of Bangor. And he served as such from about 608 to 610. But he was noted in this kind of scrap of paper that got bound in with some unrelated religious texts. But it says that he had been the first of the Irish who learned the Computus by heart. He had apparently learned this Greek method of finger counting in order to calculate the Computus, just in his mind, which is very impressive to me considering how complicated it was. So you can see a lot of times in manuscripts, they'll have these mathematical tables outlining the dates for when Easter should fall. But for him to have learned this by heart is just that extra little bit of look how impressive a learned man he is, and just goes to Bangor's position as a place of learning in not only the Irish world. It was well known in Britain itself. And then we had, of course, a number of Irish monastics who ended up back on the continent in later times to bring their wealth of knowledge and skill back to Italy and France and Germany and Switzerland and kind of all over the place.
Maybe just to recapitulate a little bit of what where each of these centers were. We're talking about Iona. Where is Iona located?
Yeah, so Iona is a small island just kind of off the southeast, I call it the foot of Mull, but off the Ross of Mull. And it's just a little island out in the Hebrides in the west coast of Scotland.
And then Lindisfarne will come into the equation. And where's that located?
Yeah, so Lindisfarne is another small island, this one off of the eastern coast of modern-day North England. It was part of Northumbria in the time period that we're talking about and when it was founded.
And then where is Bangor located?
And Bangor is, just a bit east of Belfast in Loch Belfast. So it's right on that kind of south shore of the loch. It's in great position to be able to get access to the west of Scotland. And in my own research, I talk a bit about this community of Covgall that would have involved the west of Scotland in addition to Ireland. So it's kind of a well-placed center of learning and capability and influence.
And so Bangor, I'm trying to form my own mental map here. It's more or less due west of Lindisfarne, but just on the other side of the island of England. And then Iona is just north of both of them.
Yeah, so Iona is definitely north of Bangor, but I'm having just a quick look at the map here, and it looks like Lindisfarne is just a bit north. If we're just thinking in terms of latitude, then yeah, it'll be a bit north, but yeah, on the opposite coast from where Bangor and Iona would be.
And now a word from our sponsors. Very interesting. Are there any other monasteries that we should keep in our mind going forward, or are those kind of our main players?
So we'll also have Whitby, which is where our synod is going to be. So that's one to keep in mind. Trying to think. I mean, of course, there are other important monasteries that will be important in the history of Christianity in Ireland and Britain, whether north or south. But those are going to be kind of the major players for this Synod of Whitby that we're focusing on today. But I think towards the end today, I'll probably mention a few places that it's good to do some research on if you're interested more generally.
Now, even going a little bit further into this whole issue of Computus, Ireland wasn't an entirely unified block necessarily behind one Computus methodology.
Right, that's very true. So it tended to happen that monasteries in the south of Ireland had switched to the 19-year cycle of calculation much earlier than the north, or than Iona and Dalriada had, and even Iona had switched by, I think it was 716 after Adovnan had passed away, but there were still British churches that still hadn't switched by that time. So yeah, thinking of Ireland in a single discrete unit or political bloc in this time period is not a good idea, because it's very varied, and so we'll have a lot of different things going on in different places. And yeah, that's not something that really gets brought up when we're thinking in the more simplistic terms of this Easter controversy. It really tends to be kind of all of Ireland pitted against this unified Roman model, but it's much more complex than that. And yeah, as I've said, we've got different parts of Ireland that are changing to the new calculation of Easter at different times.
What was the letter of Pope John, the Pope-elect John's letter to the Irish in 640?
So his letter we've got a lot of our evidence from Bede, so we have to kind of view it through what Bede is trying to say in his history. So they're talking about this quartodecaman error, which comes back to this idea of, in the earlier times, that it was the 14th day of Nisan, that you should celebrate Easter regardless of what day of the week it was. And so Bede's kind of poking at this a little bit, in the 84-year cycle, of course, isn't saying that, but because it does sometimes happen that way, they're kind of poking at him in that manner. But yeah, the letter is saying, look, you need to switch to this new method of calculating Easter. And I think we get a really useful understanding of the response that you tended to see from especially these northern monks or northern religious men in trying to talk about the inadequacy of the first calculation that they're trying to get them to switch to, because if you'll recall, I mentioned that there were 3 calculations going on at this time. So there were a lot of arguments being made from scripture, from previous church fathers, from previous church intellectuals, on both sides, trying to make their arguments and say, hey, this is what we should use.
It seems, why would they bring up the quartodecaman part? It seems like nobody's thinking that issue. That seems like kind of answering the wrong question.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it could just be part of this heaping up of, othering, because there's mentions of the Pelagian heresy in this time period again. And while there were some things that Pelagius said that the Irish were, in some agreement with, it was never to the point in this time period that they were becoming Pelagian heretics, but it's something else that gets brought up, and it really gives me the sense of they're trying to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks.
Oh, look at these rubes. They're quartodecamans, they're Pelagians, they're this, that, and the other thing. Now, Columbanus, he writes a letter to the Pope, and what does that bring to the party, so to speak?
Yeah, so Columbanus makes really similar arguments to what the religious cleric Colman gave at the Synod of Whitby, which is talking about the inadequacy of the Victorian Easter table. And again, he's bringing in scripture to make his arguments. I know there was a lot of discussion about whether Easter could happen during what they call a dark moon, and that this is theologically related to making the claim that Christ's sacrifice wasn't necessary for the salvation of man. So they're getting into some really deep technical theological debates about what it means for it to not happen at this specific time. He's bringing up early church intellectuals such as Anatolius, the Bishop of Laodicea, and through him, Jerome, who was said to admire Anatolius's work. So they're really digging into their intellectual traditions to kind of support their arguments. And this Victorian Easter calculation, in some cases, had 2 possible dates for Easter. And so I think that might have been part of why they're like, look, there's not meant to be 2 dates for Easter. So they didn't like the maths on it. And so why switch to something that they saw as inferior? And indeed, in Columbanus's letter, he talked about how some of the intellectuals in Ireland had looked at this calculation and had thought it worthy of derision rather than respect. And that's kind of a big statement for Columbanus to make in a letter to the Pope.
Now, you think that some of this, some of these ideas from Colman may have come from pre-Christian concepts and pre-Christian Irish intellectual traditions? So
part of my thought is, if we go back to some of the information that we get from classical authors on the pre-Christian intellectuals, so the Druids we're talking about, one of the things that they were interested in was the observation of the stars. And so they would be really into natural history and natural theology. And so I can see that kind of intellectual tradition moving forward into this calculation of Easter. So we're looking at lunar calendars. And so you're seeing that through looking at the sky and the heavens and doing these calculations. So I can really see a transfer of intellectual tradition from pre-Christian into Christian in this in general. I'm not sure that I would see it, as Coleman understanding that that's where that had come from, or him making that as an argument, but I can see how this could be a continuation of an existing intellectual tradition that was involved or interested in, doing these kinds of, calculations of time of year or holy days or things of that nature.
By this point in the 600s, would there have been any druids still hanging out somewhere?
That's an excellent question. And we do get reports in the lives of saints, and especially the life of Saint Columba, who he died in 597. And so we're told that he goes up to Fortrue to meet with King Brutha of Pickland, and that Brutha had his own court druids and that he was pagan. And, Columba goes to the Isle of Skye and meets pagans who ask to be converted. So the picture that we're given from the sources that do survive is that there were still, pagans around. They weren't everywhere. And we even see in other sources in Ireland itself, like the First Synod of St. Patrick, which actually was over 100 years after Patrick's time, that talked about, whether it was appropriate to receive alms for the church or donations for the church from pagans. Note, it was not okay. And how to engage in court cases with pagans, or they talk about not to behave in ways like pagans as kind of a pejorative term. So this is still part of this long process of conversion that we've talked about a bit previously. So we don't want to presume that just everybody is Christian at this time.
It seems to me in a lot of ways it'd be a natural transition for a druid to become a monk or a churchman, because they're intellectual class, they're living in communities, they're under the support of the kings. Was that a natural transition for a lot of druids?
I think it was a natural transition. I'm not sure that we'll ever have a bunch of, irrefutable proof that that's what happened, but we do see some similar intellectual interests, and especially in some of these stories that are getting written down, I think we can see some lines of how these intellectual traditions are coming forward from the pre-Christian period into the things that these monks and other just religious men are involved.
When I spoke with your colleague, Annie Humphreys, she said with the Vikings, there was a lot of people in the Norse, that there was a lot of people who kept one foot sort of in each camp, one pagan and Christian. They're kind of taking the best of both worlds. Was there evidence of Irish doing that?
That's an excellent question. I know Penda in kind of North Wales was kind of well known for going back to paganism when it suited him. But as far as specific people that I could think of in Ireland, I would imagine, especially in the early days, if you're seeing economic benefits to conversion and you're not having, what I like to refer to as a heartfelt conversion experience, then it makes sense. And your pre-Christian practices and theology aren't going to preclude just adding Christianity into the mix. It's really from the other side, it's the Christian side that's saying, oh no, it should just be this. So it makes a lot of sense to me that there would be a number of people who would just kind of go with what feels right at the moment and mix them together. We have this idea that it's a switch that gets flipped and you're either all one or you're all the other. But I think there's a lot of middle ground for people who don't come from a religious tradition of exclusion.